The desert breathes differently than other places. It inhales with the scorching pull of noon sun and exhales with the ghostly whisper of evening wind. In the vast expanse of the Sonoran wilderness, where saguaro cacti stand like ancient sentinels, and the horizon shimmers with heat mirages, time moves at its own pace. Here, beneath the endless dome of bleached sky, stories unfold that test the very limits of human endurance and compassion. Some tales begin with storms, others with silence. This one began with abandonment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Calloway had lived 73 years before she learned what it meant to be truly alone. Not the comfortable solitude of widowhood, which she'd known for the past decade, but the crushing, absolute isolation that comes when those you trusted most leave you to die under a merciless sun. The morning had started like any other expedition morning. The canvas of their camp stirred with the pre-dawn bustle of her grandson Timothy and his business partner, a sharp-eyed man named Henderson who spoke in numbers and wore his greed like cologne. They'd been planning this venture for months, a search for the legendary Esperanza mine, supposedly lost somewhere in the treacherous beauty of the Arizona Territory. Margaret had insisted on coming along, much to Timothy's initial protests. She wasn't just any elderly woman with romantic notions about treasure hunting. She was the keeper of her late husband's most precious secret, a hand-drawn map that Colonel William Calloway had acquired during his cavalry days, sketched by a dying prospector who swore it led to veins of gold so pure they gleamed like captured sunlight. "Grandmother, the desert is no place for—" Timothy had begun that first planning session, his voice trailing off under her sharp gaze. "Boy, I was crossing deserts when you were still learning to walk. That map has been in this family for 40 years, and I'll be damned if I'm going to hand it over to strangers and wait at home like some fragile ornament." Henderson had been more pragmatic. "Mrs. Calloway, with all due respect, your knowledge could be invaluable. The landmarks your husband noted, the terrain descriptions, they match our survey reports perfectly." What Henderson hadn't said, but what Margaret had seen in his calculating eyes, was that her presence served another purpose. An elderly woman would draw less suspicion if they encountered other prospectors or territorial officials. Who would suspect a grandmother on a family camping trip searching for lost gold? Now, as the sun climbed toward its brutal midday peak, Margaret wished she had listened to the small voice of doubt that had whispered warnings she'd chosen to ignore. The betrayal had been swift and efficient. While she dozed in the shade of their supply wagon during the hottest part of the previous day, Timothy and Henderson had quietly loaded their horses with water, provisions, and, most importantly, her husband's map. She'd awakened to find them already mounted, their faces set with the kind of determination that comes when money trumps blood. "I'm sorry, Grandmother," Timothy had said, though his eyes were already focused on the distant mountains where the map promised riches lay. "Hidden. The terrain ahead is too dangerous. We'll come back for you once we've secured the claim." Henderson had been more honest in his cruelty. "Mrs. Calloway, you've served your purpose. That map is worth more than sentiment now." They'd left her with a single canteen of warm water, a handful of hardtack biscuits, and the shade of a dying Palo Verde tree. No horse, no weapon, no hope of walking the 40 miles back to the nearest settlement before the desert claimed her. That was yesterday. Now, Margaret sat with her back against the rough bark of the Palo Verde, its sparse leaves offering precious little relief from the sun that seemed determined to burn the very life from her bones. The canteen beside her held perhaps 2 swallows of water, tasting of metal and desperation. Her lips were already beginning to crack, and she could feel the first stages of delirium creeping at the edges of her consciousness like heat mirages dancing on distant stone. But Margaret Calloway had not survived 7 decades frontier life, the loss of her husband, and the raising of an ungrateful grandson to give up easily. Even as her throat burned and her vision blurred, her mind remained sharp with a mixture of fury and determination. She thought of William, her husband of 43 years, who had died peacefully in his bed with her hand in his. How he would rage if he knew that his grandson, the boy he'd taught to ride, to shoot, to read the stars, had left his beloved wife to die alone in the wasteland. "You always said I was too stubborn to die easy, didn't you, William?" she whispered to the desert air, her voice barely more than a rasp. The map Timothy had stolen wasn't the only copy. William had been a meticulous man, a soldier who understood the value of redundancy. Hidden in the lining of Margaret's traveling bag, the one item her betrayers had deemed too worthless to steal, was a second copy, drawn in her husband's careful hand on a piece of oiled leather that could survive anything short of fire. She'd discovered it that first night, as she'd searched through her belongings by the light of a dying campfire, hoping to find some overlooked morsel of food or drop of water. Instead, she'd found something far more valuable, the power to choose her own ending. The map showed not just the location of the Esperanza mine, but also the network of seasonal water sources, hidden springs, and ancient Native American trails that crisscrossed this seemingly barren landscape. William had marked each water source with a different symbol, noting which were reliable year-round and which depended on recent rainfall. If she was going to die out here, Margaret decided, she wouldn't die as a victim of her grandson's greed. She would die on her own terms, walking toward hope rather than waiting for death to find her. The desert had taught her patience during the long years she'd lived on the frontier. It had taught her to read the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death, the flight patterns of birds that led to water, the types of rock formations that provided shade during the killing hours of midday, the way certain plants pointed toward underground springs. As the sun reached its zenith on her second day alone, Margaret forced herself to stand. Her legs trembled with weakness, but her will remained iron strong. She tucked the precious map into her bodice, shouldered her small traveling bag, and began to walk. Not toward the distant settlement that might as well have been on the moon, but deeper into the desert, following the landmarks her husband had so carefully noted. According to his map, there should be a seasonal spring approximately 3 miles southeast, nestled in a box canyon where Apache hunting parties had once made camp. Each step was an act of defiance against the circumstances that had brought her here. The sun beat down like a physical weight, pressing her toward the earth with merciless intensity. The rocky ground radiated heat through the thin soles of her traveling boots, and the dry air seemed to steal moisture from her lungs with every breath. But Margaret had endured hardship before. She remembered the winter of 1847, when she and William had been snowed in for 3 months with nothing but salt pork and dried corn. She remembered the summer her youngest child had been born during a fever epidemic, when she'd nursed both baby and husband back to health with nothing but prayer and stubborn love. This desert was just another test, another challenge to overcome. As she walked, she began to notice details that her despair had initially obscured. The way certain cacti seemed to lean in specific directions, following underground water sources, the flight patterns of hawks and ravens who knew the location of every spring and seep within 50 miles, the subtle differences in soil color that indicated where flash floods had once carved temporary rivers through the landscape. Her husband's military training had made him an excellent observer of terrain, but 40 years of frontier life had made Margaret something perhaps more valuable, a reader of the land's deeper rhythms. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western mountains when she first spotted the canyon. It appeared gradually, emerging from the heat haze like something from a fever dream. The entrance was narrow, almost hidden between two towering walls of red sandstone that had been carved by millennia of flash floods and wind. Margaret paused at the canyon mouth, swaying slightly on her feet. The last drops of water from her canteen were long gone, and her tongue felt thick and foreign in her mouth. But there, carved into the stone near the entrance, she could make out the faint traces of ancient petroglyphs, spirals and animal, figures that spoke of human presence stretching back countless generations. This was the place William had marked on his map. The seasonal spring should be just around the first bend, where the canyon walls opened into a small amphitheater of stone. She stumbled forward, each step requiring tremendous effort. The canyon walls rose around her, providing blessed shade, but also trapping the day's accumulated heat like an oven. The silence was profound, broken only by the scrape of her boots on stone and the labored rhythm of her breathing. Then she heard it, the impossible, beautiful sound of water trickling over rock. The spring was exactly where William's map had promised, seeping from a crack in the canyon wall and forming a small, clear pool at the base of the red stone. Margaret fell to her knees beside it, cupping the precious liquid in her trembling hands and drinking deeply for the first time in 2 days. The water was sweet and cold, tasting of minerals and stone and life itself. She drank until her stomach ached, then splashed the miraculous liquid on her face and neck, washing away the grime and desperation of the past 48 hours. Only then did she allow herself to truly examine her surroundings. The canyon was larger than it had appeared from the entrance, opening into a natural amphitheater perhaps 50 yards across. Ancient cottonwood trees grew near the spring, their roots finding purchase in the rocky soil. The walls were decorated with more petroglyphs, hunting scenes, star charts, and symbols whose meanings had been lost to time. But it was the remains of old campsites that caught her attention. Stone circles where fires had once burned, worn, smooth by use, grinding holes carved into flat rocks where corn and seeds had been processed. This place had been used by travelers for generations, perhaps centuries. Margaret settled herself in the shade of the largest cottonwood and allowed herself to truly rest for the first time since Timothy and Henderson had abandoned her. The immediate crisis was over. She had found water, shade, and shelter. But she was still alone in the desert, still 40 miles from civilization, still an elderly woman with limited supplies, facing an uncertain future. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the sun set and the canyon walls began to glow with reflected light, she took out her husband's map and studied it more carefully. The spring was marked as a way station, not a destination. According to William's notes, there were at least 3 more water sources between here and the location of the Esperanza mine, each one carefully plotted and described. But more importantly, the map showed alternative routes, ways to reach settlements and mining camps that didn't require retracing her steps toward the place where she'd been betrayed. Paths that led through Apache territory, dangerous but potentially passable for someone who knew how to read the signs and respect the land. For the first time since her ordeal began, Margaret allowed herself to consider a possibility that went beyond mere survival. She was 73 years old, abandoned and left for dead, but she possessed something her betrayers didn't know about: knowledge. The real map, the complete map, with all of William's carefully noted landmarks and water sources. What if, instead of simply trying to survive until rescue came, she continued forward? What if she followed her husband's map to its ultimate destination, not for gold, but for vindication? Timothy and Henderson might have stolen one copy of the map, but they didn't have the complete picture. They didn't know about the seasonal variations in water sources, the dangerous passages that could be safely navigated only at certain times of year. the Apache trails that offered shortcuts known only to those who had lived in this country for decades. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above the canyon, Margaret made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. She would not wait for rescue. She would not try to retreat to safety. She would move forward, following her husband's map deeper into the desert, toward the legendary mine that had cost so many men their lives and fortunes. Not because she cared about gold, but because she refused to let her story end with abandonment and defeat. The desert night brought its own challenges. The temperature dropped dramatically, and Margaret's light clothing provided little protection against the chill. She gathered dead wood from the cottonwoods and built a small fire in one of the ancient stone circles, feeling a deep connection to all the other travelers who had warmed themselves at this same spot across the centuries. As the flames danced and cast shifting shadows on the canyon walls, she thought about the strange turns her life had taken. 3 days ago, she had been a grandmother on what she believed was a family adventure. Now she was something else entirely, a desert wanderer, carrying secrets and maps, pursuing a destiny she couldn't yet fully understand. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up toward the star-filled sky. In the distance, she could hear the calls of night creatures, owls, coyotes, the rustle of small animals moving through the brush. The sounds were wild and primal, but somehow comforting. She was not the only living thing making its way through this harsh landscape. Margaret wrapped herself in her shawl and leaned back against the smooth stone of the canyon wall. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new tests of her resolve. But tonight, for the first time since her ordeal began, she felt something approaching peace. She was alive. She had water. She had a destination. And somewhere out, there in the vast desert night, carried on winds that had been blowing since the world was young, she could almost hear her husband's voice whispering encouragement. The desert had tried to claim her, but Margaret Calloway was not ready to be claimed. Not yet. Not when she had a map to follow and a betrayal to answer. Dawn came to the canyon like a whispered promise, painting the red stone walls with shades of amber and rose. Margaret woke slowly, her body stiff from sleeping on hard ground, but her mind clearer than it had been in days. The spring continued its gentle music, and the cottonwood leaves rustled with the first stirrings of morning wind. She drank deeply from the spring and ate one of her precious remaining biscuits, savoring each crumb while studying her husband's map in the growing light. According to William's careful notations, the next water source lay 8 miles northeast, at a place he'd marked as Devil's Backbone, apparently a narrow ridge that connected 2 mesas with a hidden tank that collected rainwater in natural basins carved from solid rock. The name alone suggested treacherous terrain, but Margaret had learned to trust her husband's judgment in such matters. William had been cautious to a fault, never marking a route he hadn't personally traveled or verified through reliable sources. She packed her few belongings and set out while the air was still cool, following game trails that wound through stands of barrel cactus and creosote bush. The desert was alive with morning activity, roadrunners darting between the scrub, lizards basking in sun-warmed rocks, and high overhead, turkey vultures riding the early thermals in lazy circles. The landscape began to change as she climbed. Higher, the flat desert floor giving way to broken country filled with arroyos, hidden valleys, and towering rock formations that cast long shadows in the slanted light. This was an older country, more complex, where flash floods had carved intricate patterns in the stone, and wind had sculpted monuments that seemed almost deliberate in their beauty. Margaret found herself moving with increasing confidence. The terrible weakness of the first 2 days had passed, replaced by a kind of focused energy she remembered from her younger years on the frontier. Her body was adapting to the rhythm of desert travel, walking in the cool hours, resting during Midday heat pressing forward again as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, but it was more than physical adaptation. Something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of herself and her situation. The despair and shock of abandonment had transformed into something harder and more purposeful. She was no longer a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She was a woman with a destination, a map, and the skills to read both. The trail began to climb more steeply as she approached the area William had marked as Devil's Backbone. The terrain became increasingly dramatic, towering spires of red sandstone, narrow passages between vertical walls, and everywhere the evidence of water's patient work carving beauty from solid rock. It was in one of these narrow passages, where the walls rose nearly 100 feet on either side and the sky appeared as a ribbon of blue overhead, that Margaret first sensed she was being watched. The feeling came gradually, a prickling at the back of her neck that made her pause and listen more carefully to the sounds around her. The canyon was not silent. Wind moaned through hidden openings in the rock, and somewhere water dripped with steady persistence. But there was something else, a quality of attention that seemed to press against her awareness like heat radiating. From stone, she continued walking, but with heightened alertness. Her frontier-trained senses catalogued every shadow, every movement of vegetation, every sound that didn't quite fit the natural rhythm of the place. Twice she thought she glimpsed movement on the canyon rim high above, but when she looked directly, there was nothing but sky and stone. The passage opened suddenly into a natural amphitheater where several canyons converged. And there, exactly as William's map had promised, was Devil's Backbone, a knife-edge ridge of stone that connected two towering mesas, like a bridge thrown across empty air. The formation was both beautiful and terrifying, no more than 6 feet wide at its narrowest point, with drops of several hundred feet on either side. Margaret approached the base of the ridge and found the beginning of what had once been a trail, worn handholds and footholds carved into the stone, probably by Native American travelers over countless generations. The path was still passable, though it required careful attention and steady nerves. She began to climb, testing each handhold before trusting her weight to it. The ascent was slow and demanding, but not beyond her capabilities. Years of ranch work had kept her hands strong and her balance sure, and the knowledge that water waited at the top provided powerful motivation. Halfway up the ridge, she paused to rest and scan the surrounding country. From this vantage point, she could see, for miles in every direction, a vast landscape of mesas, canyons, and distant mountains that seemed to stretch beyond the edge of the world. The beauty was overwhelming and terrible, a reminder of just how small and temporary human presence was in this ancient land. It was while she rested that she first saw him clearly. He stood on the rim of the opposite mesa, perhaps 300 yards away, motionless as the stone itself. A young man, tall and lean, with long black hair that moved slightly in the wind. Even at that distance, she could sense the quality of his attention, the way he watched her with the focused intensity of a hunter, Apache. The word came to her mind without fear, just recognition. She had lived long enough on the frontier to know the difference between observation and threat, and what she sensed from the distant figure was curiosity rather than hostility. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the gulf of air and stone. Then, slowly and deliberately, Margaret raised her hand in greeting. The gesture was simple, universal, carrying no aggression or demand, just acknowledgement of shared presence in this vast wilderness. The young man did not respond immediately. He continued to watch her with that predatory stillness that spoke of perfect integration with his environment. Then, just as slowly, he raised his own hand in reply. The brief exchange changed something. fundamental about her situation. She was no longer alone in the desert. Someone else knew of her presence, someone who belonged to this country in ways she never could. The knowledge was both comforting and unsettling. She had gained a witness to her journey, but also a potential complication she couldn't yet evaluate. She resumed her climb, acutely aware that she was still being observed. The trail continued, to wind upward along the ridge, sometimes following the very crest where a misstep would mean certain death, sometimes cutting slightly to one side or the other where the stone provided more secure footing. Near the top, she discovered why William had chosen to mark this place on his map. Hidden in a depression at the summit were several natural tanks carved from solid rock, each one holding crystal-clear rainwater from recent storms. The largest tank was perhaps 10 feet across and 3 feet deep, enough water to sustain a small party for weeks. Margaret knelt beside the nearest tank and drank gratefully, then refilled her canteen and splashed the cool water on her face and neck. The exertion of the climb had left her hot and tired, but also exhilarated. She had accomplished something that many people half her age would have found daunting. As she rested in the shade of a wind-carved arch near the water tanks, she studied her husband's map more carefully. Devil's Backbone was marked as a major way station, a place where multiple routes converged. According to William's notes, Apache hunting parties had used this spot for generations, leaving evidence of their presence in the form of cached supplies, carved symbols, and carefully maintained trails. She found some of that evidence as she explored the summit. Stone circles where fires had burned, pictographs painted on protected rock surfaces, and several sealed caches hidden in crevices where travelers could leave supplies for those who might follow. One cache in particular caught her attention. It was larger than the others and more carefully constructed, sealed with fitted stones and what appeared to be pine pitch. The style was different, too, less ancient than the others, more recent in its construction. Margaret examined the cache thoughtfully. Frontier etiquette regarding such things was complex. Disturbing another traveler's supplies could mean the difference between life and death for whoever had placed them there. But the cache showed signs of age and weathering that suggested it might have been abandoned. After considerable internal debate, she carefully opened the sealed entrance. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, she found supplies that made her heart race: jerked meat, parched corn, a small bag of salt, and most precious of all, a gourd water container that could hold nearly a gallon. But it was the other items in the cache that truly captured her attention. There were tools, a well-made knife, steel and flint for fire starting, several arrowheads napped from obsidian. And there were personal items that spoke of careful preparation and deep knowledge of desert travel. A small pouch of medicinal herbs, strips of sinew for repairs, and a piece of turquoise carved into the shape of a bird. At the bottom of the cache, wrapped separately in soft deerskin, was something that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. It was another map, drawn on a prepared hide with pigments that had remained bright despite the years. But this map was different from her husband's careful military cartography. This one showed the country from a perspective that spoke of intimate knowledge, of someone who had walked every trail and known every water source. The two maps complemented each other perfectly. William showed the major landmarks and routes with military precision, while this one revealed the subtle details that could make the difference between success and disaster. Seasonal variations in water flow, dangerous passages that looked safe, hidden shortcuts known only to those who had grown up in this country. Margaret studied both maps with growing excitement. Together, they provided a more complete picture of the route to the Esperanza mine than either one alone. But more than that, they suggested a connection between her husband and whoever had prepared this cache, a sharing of knowledge that transcended the usual boundaries between cultures. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Instead of hoarding the cache's contents for her own survival, she would take only what she absolutely needed and leave the rest, along with some of her own supplies, for other travelers who might pass this way. It was a gesture that spoke to something deeper than mere survival instinct. In this harsh country, where water and shade could mean the difference between life and death, the tradition of shared resources was sacred. Whoever had prepared this cache had understood that principle, and Margaret felt obligated to honor it. She selected the jerked meat and parched corn, items that would significantly extend her own supplies. She took the gourd water container, which would allow her to carry more water between sources. But she left the tools and most of the other items, adding some of her own hardtack and a small silver locket that had belonged to her mother. A token of gratitude and respect for whoever had made this gift possible. As she prepared to descend from Devil's Backbone, Margaret became aware that she was still being watched. The young Apache man had moved closer during the afternoon, positioning himself on a rocky outcrop where he could observe her activities around the water tanks. His continued presence was both reassuring and puzzling. He seemed content to watch without approaching, maintaining a careful distance that spoke of respect rather than hostility. The descent proved more challenging than the ascent, requiring her to move slowly and test each foothold carefully as the shadows deepened and the light began to fail. By the time she reached the canyon floor, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky overhead. She made camp in a sheltered alcove near the base of Devil's Backbone, building a small fire from driftwood that flash floods had deposited. Among the rocks, the jerked meat from the cache provided the first substantial meal she'd had in days, and the additional water gave her a sense of security she hadn't felt since leaving the spring. As she sat beside her fire, studying the two maps by flickering light, Margaret reflected on the strange turns her journey had taken. What had begun as a desperate flight from abandonment was transforming into something else entirely. A pilgrimage, perhaps, or a quest whose ultimate purpose she couldn't yet understand. The presence of the Apache observer added another layer of complexity to her situation. His continued interest suggested more than casual curiosity. Perhaps he was a scout for a larger group, evaluating whether she represented a threat or opportunity. Or perhaps he was simply intrigued by the unusual sight of an elderly white woman, traveling alone through a country that claimed the lives of younger, better-equipped men. Whatever his motives, his presence had changed the fundamental nature of her journey. She was no longer alone with her maps and memories, no longer isolated in her struggle against the desert's challenges. Someone else was now part of her story, though she couldn't yet guess what role he might play. As the fire burned lower and the night sounds of the desert began to emerge from the cooling air, Margaret made another decision that would have surprised her younger self. Instead of trying to hide her presence or alter her route to avoid further contact, she would continue on her planned path. If the young Apache wanted to observe her journey, she would let him. If he chose to approach, she would meet him with the same openness she had shown in their brief exchange of greetings. The frontier had taught her that survival often depended on reading people as carefully as reading the land. And what she had read in that distant figure was not menace, but something more complex. Intelligence, curiosity, and perhaps even a form of respect for her determination to travel through a country that commanded respect from anyone who entered it. She banked her fire carefully and wrapped herself in her shawl, using her traveling bag as a pillow. Above her, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, the same stars that had guided travelers through this country for thousands of years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new decisions, but tonight she felt a quiet confidence that had been missing since her ordeal began. The desert had tested her and found her worthy of continued existence. She had water, food, shelter, and direction. She had maps that revealed secrets known to few living people. And somewhere in the darkness beyond her fire's glow, She had acquired what every desert traveler needed most, a witness to her passage through the wilderness. Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the night sounds. The distant call of coyotes, the whisper of wind through stone, and somewhere, so faint it might have been imagination, the sound of another small fire crackling in the darkness. She was no longer alone, and that knowledge carried her gently into sleep. The third day of Margaret's transformed journey began with revelation. She woke to find a small bundle placed carefully beside her cold fire pit, not close enough to startle her awake, but positioned where she couldn't miss it upon rising. The placement spoke of someone who had approached during the deep hours of night, with skills that bordered on the supernatural. Inside the bundle, wrapped in soft rabbit fur, were 3 items that made her pulse quicken. Fresh, prickly pear pads, carefully cleaned of their spines and ready to eat. A handful of pine nuts, rich with oil and nutrition. And most telling of all, a small piece of charcoal that had been shaped into a crude drawing tool. Margaret examined the charcoal carefully. One end had been sharpened to a fine point, while the other remained rough for broader strokes. It was clearly meant for communication, for making marks that could bridge the gap between 2 people who shared no common language. She looked around the canyon carefully, searching for any sign of her mysterious benefactor, but saw nothing except the morning shadows retreating up the canyon walls. Whoever had left these gifts possessed skills that made him nearly invisible, even in relatively open country. The prickly pear pads were a godsend. Margaret had heard of their nutritional value, but had never learned the proper technique for preparing them. These had been expertly cleaned, with even the smallest spines removed. She ate them slowly, savoring their moisture and subtle flavor, feeling strength flow back into her body with each bite. As she packed her belongings and prepared to continue her journey, Margaret made a decision that would alter the course of everything that followed. Using the gifted charcoal, she drew a simple map in the smooth sand near her fire pit. Not her husband's precious map or the one from the cache, but a basic sketch showing her intended route for the day. It was an act of trust that went against every survival instinct she'd developed during 40 years of frontier life. By revealing her planned movements, she was making herself vulnerable to ambush, robbery, or worse. But something in the careful placement of the gifts, in the respectful distance her observer had maintained, suggested that traditional fears might not apply to this situation. She drew the landmarks she expected to encounter based on her maps, a distinctive rock formation that resembled a sleeping giant, a narrow canyon that supposedly contained ancient cliff dwellings, and finally a place William had marked as Turquoise Springs, where she hoped to find her next water source. Before leaving the sand map, Margaret added one more element. Using the fine point of the charcoal, she drew a small bird in flight, not unlike the carved turquoise bird she had found in the cache. It was a symbol that transcended cultural boundaries, representing freedom, hope, and the spirit's ability to soar above earthly constraints. The morning's travel took her through a country that seemed designed by some mad god, with a passion for both beauty and treachery. Narrow passages opened suddenly into vast amphitheaters. Gentle slopes revealed themselves as approaches to terrifying precipices. What appeared to be solid ground often proved to be merely a thin crust over hidden caverns. Margaret moved carefully, testing each step and consulting both maps frequently. The hidden map, drawn on prepared hide with native pigments, proved especially valuable in this terrain. Its unknown creator had marked dangers that William's military survey had missed, places where flash floods created temporary but deadly waterfalls, sections of trail that became impassable during certain wind conditions, and spots where rockfall posed constant threats. As she navigated these hazards, Margaret became increasingly aware of a presence paralleling her route, not directly following, but moving through the country in a way that kept her general location under observation. Occasionally she glimpsed movement on distant ridges or caught the faint sound of displaced stones from hidden passages. Her invisible companion's skill was remarkable. Despite her years of frontier experience, she could detect his presence only through the most subtle signs. A raven's call that seemed slightly out of place, a pattern of shadows that suggested recent passage, the feeling of being watched, that prickled at the edges of her awareness. The rock formation, that resembled a sleeping giant, appeared exactly where her maps had promised, rising from the desert floor like a massive human figure stretched out in eternal repose. The geological accident that had created this landmark was extraordinary. Wind and water erosion had carved features so realistic that Margaret found herself staring at what appeared to be a stone face in profile, complete with closed eyes and slightly parted lips. Near the base of the sleeping giant, she found evidence of the hidden map's superior accuracy. William's survey had noted the landmark, but missed a crucial detail: a narrow cleft in the rock that provided access to a series of natural chambers within the formation. The native map showed this hidden passage clearly, along with symbols that suggested it had been used as shelter for countless generations. Margaret explored the cleft cautiously, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. The passage opened into a natural room, perhaps 20 feet across, with a smoke-blackened ceiling that spoke of countless fires. The walls were covered with pictographs, hunting scenes, astronomical observations, and abstract patterns whose meanings had been lost to time, but it was the more recent additions that captured her attention. Mixed among the ancient images were markings that clearly belonged to her own era, names carved in English, dates from the 1860s and 1870s, and most intriguingly, several sketches that matched landmarks she had been following. One carving in particular made her breath catch. Carved with obvious care into a smooth section of wall were two names, Cole W. Calloway, and below it, in different handwriting, Ayana, daughter of Cochise. Margaret stared at the inscription for a long time, her mind racing with implications. Her husband had never mentioned meeting any Apache leaders, certainly not Cochise or members of his family. But here was evidence of some kind of encounter, carved in stone and preserved by the desert's dry air. She examined the surrounding carvings more carefully and found additional clues. There were sketches of the route she had been following, clearly, drawn by someone familiar with both maps. There were symbols that appeared on both the military survey and the native map, and there were what appeared to be two different hands working together, one precise and geometric in the European style, the other flowing and organic in the manner of indigenous art. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her husband and someone from Cochise's band had traveled this route together. They had sheltered in this same chamber, shared knowledge, and collaborated on mapping this treacherous country. The two maps she carried weren't separate documents created by different cultures. They were part of a single, collaborative effort to chart the way to the Esperanza mine. Margaret sank onto a natural stone seat, worn smooth by countless occupants, trying to process this revelation. William had always been close-mouthed about his military service, deflecting questions about specific campaigns or encounters. She had assumed it was simply a soldier's reluctance to burden civilians with harsh realities of frontier warfare. But this suggested something entirely different. Instead of fighting Apache warriors, William had apparently worked with them. Instead of the usual narrative of conflict and conquest, there had been cooperation and mutual respect. The implications were staggering, not just for her understanding of her husband, but for her current situation. If William had earned the trust and cooperation of Apache guides, then her presence in this country might be viewed differently than she had assumed. She wasn't just another white intruder to be watched and possibly eliminated. She was the widow of someone who had shown respect for indigenous knowledge and been trusted with sacred information. The realization transformed her understanding of her mysterious observer. He wasn't simply curious about an unusual traveler. He might actually be protecting her, ensuring safe passage through the country that few outsiders ever saw. Margaret spent the rest of the morning exploring the chamber and copying some of the more important markings into her own notebook. The collaboration between her husband and his Apache guide had been extensive. They had documented water sources, seasonal variations in access routes, and dangerous areas with a thoroughness that spoke of multiple journeys through this country. One set of markings particularly intrigued her. They showed a complex route through what appeared to be a maze of canyons, with careful notations about timing and water availability. According to these notes, there was a hidden passage that could cut days off the journey to the mine, but it required precise timing to coincide with seasonal springs that flowed only during certain months. When she finally emerged from the sleeping giant's hidden chamber, the sun was approaching its zenith. She found shade beneath an overhanging ledge and prepared for the midday rest that desert travel demanded. But as she settled into the cool shadows, she became aware that something had changed. Her observer was closer now, much closer. He sat perhaps 50 yards away, positioned on a natural stone seat where he could watch her without obstruction. In the full light of day, she could see him clearly for the first time. He was young, probably no more than 25, with the lean build and graceful posture of someone completely at home in this harsh environment. His clothing was a mixture of traditional and practical, buckskin leggings and moccasins, but also a cotton shirt that had probably been traded from Mexican settlements to the south. What struck her most forcefully was his face. It held the same intelligent intensity she had sensed from a distance, but now she could see something else, a resemblance that made her heart skip. The bone structure, the set of the eyes, even the way he held his head, reminded her powerfully of the carving she had just discovered. Margaret made another decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Instead of pretending not to notice him or retreating into defensive postures, she raised her hand in the same greeting gesture she had used the day before. Then, moving slowly and deliberately, she took out her notebook and began to sketch. Her drawing skills were limited, but she managed a recognizable representation of the sleeping giant formation. Below it, she drew the entrance to the hidden chamber, and at the bottom of the page she carefully copied the carved names she had found inside. When she finished, she tore the page from her notebook and weighted it down with a stone in the space between them, not close enough to seem threatening, but positioned where he could retrieve it easily if he chose. Then she waited. The young Apache man studied her for a long time before moving. When he finally rose and approached the paper, his movements were fluid and cautious, like a wild animal accepting food from human hands. He examined her drawing carefully, then looked up at her with an expression that had shifted from curiosity to something approaching recognition. He spoke for the first time, his voice carrying clearly across the small distance between them. The words were in his own language, but the tone was questioning. Margaret couldn't understand the specific meaning, but she sensed he was asking about the names she had copied. She pointed to herself and said clearly, "Margaret Calloway." Then she pointed to the paper and repeated, "William Calloway." Understanding dawned in the young man's eyes. He looked at her with new attention, as if seeing her for the first time despite days of observation. Then he pointed to himself and spoke a name that sounded like flowing water. Nalnish. The formal introduction seemed to break an invisible barrier between them. Nalnish approached more closely, settling onto a rock perhaps 10 feet away, close enough for easier communication, but still respecting the boundaries that existed between their worlds. He spoke again, pointing to the paper and then to the sleeping giant formation. Margaret caught one word that sounded familiar: Ayana. He was asking about the woman whose name was carved beside her husband's. Margaret nodded and pointed to the formation, then made a gesture she hoped would convey the passage of time. She held up her hands to show the number 10 twice, trying to indicate that the meeting had happened 20 years ago. Nalnish watched her attempts at communication with what might have been amusement. Then he did something that completely surprised her. He reached into a pouch at his side and withdrew a folded piece of cloth. Inside was a small daguerreotype photograph, the kind that traveling photographers had made popular on the frontier. The image showed two people standing beside a distinctive rock formation. One was unmistakably her husband, though 20 years younger than she had known him. The other was a young Apache woman with intelligent eyes and an expression of quiet dignity. Margaret stared at the photograph, her understanding of her husband's past shifting once again. This wasn't just a military collaboration or a brief alliance of convenience. The care with which the photograph had been preserved, the fact that it was still carried by someone of the next generation, suggested something deeper and more lasting. Nalnish pointed to the woman in the photograph and spoke her name again, Ayana. Then he pointed to himself and spoke what Margaret gradually realized was a relationship term. He was telling her that Ayana was his mother. The implications hit her like a landslide. She was looking at the son of the woman who had traveled with her husband, who had shared the knowledge that created the maps she now carried. The young man who had been observing her journey wasn't a random scout or curious stranger. He was connected to her own story in ways that transcended the usual boundaries between cultures. Margaret felt tears threatening and struggled to maintain her composure. The loneliness and abandonment that had driven her into the desert seemed suddenly less absolute. She wasn't just following her husband's maps through hostile territory. She was retracing a path that had been walked before by people who had found ways to bridge the gaps between their worlds. Nalnish seemed to understand her emotional response. He spoke softly in his own language, the tone gentle and reassuring. Then he pointed to the photograph, to the sleeping giant formation, and finally to the route ahead. The message was clear. He would continue to accompany her journey, not as an observer or potential threat, but as a guide carrying knowledge that complemented her own. The afternoon that followed transformed Margaret's understanding of desert travel. Nalnish didn't simply parallel her route. He began actively guiding it. He showed her shortcuts that didn't appear on either map, warned her away from areas where recent rockfall had made passage dangerous, and led her to a water source that provided the sweetest, coldest water she had tasted since leaving civilization. Their communication remained limited, but it grew more sophisticated as the hours passed. Nalnish had clearly picked up some English during his contacts with white settlers and traders. Margaret discovered she could understand more of his language than she had expected, probably through exposure to Apache workers who had occasionally been employed on frontier ranches. More importantly, they were developing a shared vocabulary of gestures, expressions, and simple drawings that allowed them to exchange increasingly complex information. When Nalnish wanted to warn her about a dangerous passage ahead, he could sketch it quickly in the sand. When Margaret needed to indicate how much water she carried, she could show him the containers and use hand signals to communicate quantity. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they reached the canyon that supposedly contained ancient cliff dwellings. The formation was even more spectacular than Margaret had imagined. A series of natural alcoves carved into vertical cliff faces, each one containing the remarkably preserved remains of stone buildings that predated any European presence in the region by centuries. Nalnish led her to a specific dwelling that had been modified for use by more recent travelers. The ancient stone walls had been supplemented with newer construction, creating a comfortable shelter with protection from wind and weather. Most importantly, it contained a reliable water source, a spring that emerged from the back wall of the cave and collected in a natural basin. As they settled in for the night, Margaret realized that her journey had entered an entirely new phase. She was no longer a desperate woman fleeing abandonment and death. She had become part of a continuing story that connected past and present, that bridged the gap between cultures that were supposedly locked in perpetual conflict. The maps she carried weren't just guides to a lost gold mine. They were evidence of cooperation and mutual respect that transcended the usual narratives of frontier history. And the young man who now shared her fire wasn't just a guide or protector. He was the living embodiment of connections that had been forged in this same harsh country a generation earlier. As darkness settled over the canyon and the first stars appeared in the narrow strip of sky visible between the cliff walls, Margaret felt a peace she hadn't known since her husband's death. She was no longer alone in the world. The threads that connected her to the past hadn't been severed by William's passing or broken by Timothy's betrayal. They had simply been waiting for her to follow them into the desert, where stories older than memory continued to unfold beneath. The eternal stars, the cliff dwelling that had sheltered countless travelers across the centuries, now held two people whose presence there defied every convention of their respective worlds. Margaret woke before dawn to find Nalnish already moving quietly about their shared camp, tending a small fire that cast dancing shadows on the ancient stone walls. He had prepared a breakfast that revealed the depth of his desert knowledge. Roasted seeds from various cacti, a tea brewed from desert willow bark that had medicinal properties, and strips of venison jerky that had been seasoned with wild herbs. The care he took in presenting the meal spoke of hospitality traditions that transcended cultural boundaries. As they ate in companionable silence, Margaret studied the young man who had become her unlikely guide. In the firelight, she could see details she had missed the previous day. His hands bore the calluses of someone skilled in both traditional crafts and modern tools. His clothing showed expert repair work that spoke of self-sufficiency born from necessity. Most tellingly, his eyes held the alertness of someone who had learned to read danger in the subtlest signs. When the meal was finished, Nalnish produced something that made Margaret's breath catch. From a carefully wrapped bundle, he withdrew a map drawn on prepared deerskin, but this one was different from any she had seen. It showed the country they were traveling through, but from a perspective that encompassed not just the physical landscape, but the spiritual and cultural significance of various locations. Sacred sites were marked with symbols that spoke of ceremonies and pilgrimages, stretching back generations. Seasonal camps were indicated with notations about when different bands might be found there. Most importantly, the map showed the complex network of relationships between different Apache groups, Mexican settlements, and the few white outposts that dotted this vast territory. Nalnish spread the map between them and began to speak, mixing English words with his own language and supplementing both with gestures and sketches in the sand. Gradually, Margaret began to understand that he was warning her about more than just the physical dangers of desert travel. The country ahead was becoming increasingly unstable. Apache bands that had maintained uneasy truces with white settlers were being pressured by both American territorial authorities and Mexican military forces. Young warriors, frustrated by the failure of peaceful approaches, were beginning to listen to leaders who advocated for more aggressive resistance. More immediately threatening was the presence of what Nalnish called bad men, white outlaws, and Mexican bandits who preyed on anyone weak enough to be victimized. These groups had been driven into the desert by law enforcement efforts in more settled areas, and they survived by robbing travelers, rustling livestock, and selling information to whoever would pay for it. According to Nalnish's intelligence, at least 2 such groups were currently operating in the region Margaret needed to cross to reach the Esperanza mine. One was led by a former Confederate soldier named Dawson, who had turned to banditry after the war. The other consisted mainly of Mexican deserters who had fled military service and now lived by theft and intimidation. But the most immediate danger came from an unexpected source. Timothy and Henderson, Margaret's betrayers, had not simply ridden off to claim the mine for themselves. They had spread word in the territorial settlements that an elderly woman was wandering alone in Apache country, probably carrying valuable information about gold deposits. The story they told painted Margaret as a confused widow who didn't understand the value of what she possessed. They had offered a reward for her rescue, knowing that any bounty hunters who found her would likely claim both the reward and whatever maps or information she carried. Nalnish had learned of this bounty through the complex communication network that connected Apache camps, Mexican villages, and white settlements. Traders, scouts, and mixed-blood intermediaries carried news across cultural boundaries, creating an information system that often knew about events before official authorities did. The news that armed men were actively searching for her transformed Margaret's situation completely. What had begun as a personal quest for vindication was becoming a race against time and hostile forces. She was no longer simply following maps toward a distant goal. She was fleeing pursuit while navigating through a country where wrong turns could be fatal. Nalnish's response to this intelligence revealed the depth of his commitment to her safety. Instead of suggesting that she turn back or seek protection in white settlements, he began planning a route that would avoid the most obvious search areas while still allowing them to reach their destination. His knowledge of the country was extraordinary. He knew which water sources were likely to be watched, which trails were too obvious for safety, and which areas could provide concealment for extended periods if necessary. More importantly, he understood the thinking patterns of both Apache warriors and white bounty hunters, allowing him to predict where dangers were most likely to emerge. The route he proposed would take them through some of the most challenging terrain in the territory, a series of hidden canyons and mesa-top trails that few outsiders had ever seen. The journey would be longer and more difficult, but it would keep them away from the main travel corridors where searchers were most likely to concentrate their efforts. Margaret listened to his plan with growing admiration for his tactical thinking. The young man, who had seemed like a simple desert wanderer, was revealing himself to be a sophisticated strategist with access to intelligence networks that most military commanders would envy. But accepting his guidance would mean trusting him completely. The route he proposed would take them through the heart of Apache country, following trails that existed only in indigenous memory. If his motives were other than he claimed, she would be completely at his mercy in country where no rescue was possible. The decision required her to confront her deepest assumptions about race, culture, and the nature of human character. Everything she had been taught about Apache people suggested that trusting one would be suicidal folly. But everything she had experienced since meeting Nalnish contradicted those teachings. Margaret studied the young man's face as he outlined his plan, searching for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. What she saw instead was genuine concern for her welfare and a kind of professional pride in his ability to navigate the challenges ahead. His investment in her safety seemed to go beyond mere duty or cultural obligation. She made her choice with the same decisiveness she had shown throughout her transformed journey. "I trust you," she said simply. "Lead the way." Nalnish nodded, but she could see relief in his expression. Her willingness to follow him into the most remote parts of his homeland meant more than simple acceptance of his guidance. It represented a level of trust that few white people had ever shown to Apache guides. They broke camp immediately, following a barely visible trail that wound upward through breaks in the cliff face. The ascent was challenging, requiring them to help each other over particularly difficult sections, but it led to a hidden mesa top that provided sweeping views of the surrounding country. From this vantage point, Nalnish could show Margaret the complexity of the landscape they needed to navigate. What appeared from below to be a single mountain range revealed itself as a maze of parallel ridges, hidden valleys, and isolated peaks that created dozens of different microclimates and travel routes. He pointed out landmarks that would guide their journey, a distinctive rock spire that marked the entrance to a hidden canyon, a saddle between two peaks that provided access to otherwise impassable country, and a series of seasonal lakes that appeared only during years of unusual rainfall. But he also showed her the dangers. Smoke rising from what might be a hostile camp, dust clouds that could indicate the movement of mounted groups, areas where the terrain funneled travelers into predictable routes that could easily be watched or ambushed. The morning's travel took them across country that seemed designed to test both their physical capabilities and their growing partnership. Narrow ledges required them to move single file, with the leader testing each step before the follower committed their weight. Stream crossings demanded coordination to help each other maintain balance on slippery rocks. Most challenging were the places where they needed to descend steep faces using handholds that were barely adequate for their purpose. Nalnish would go first, finding the route and positioning himself to assist Margaret. Her age was beginning to tell in these situations, but her frontier-toughened body and stubborn determination proved equal to the challenges. What impressed her most was Nalnish's patience with her limitations. He never showed impatience with her slower pace or need for more frequent rest stops. Instead, he used these pauses to point out details of the landscape, share knowledge about edible plants, or tell stories about the history of places they passed. Through these conversations, Margaret began to understand that her companion was far more than a simple guide. He was an educated man who spoke 3 languages fluently and could communicate in several others. He had attended a mission school for several years before deciding that his future lay with his own people rather than in the white world. His knowledge extended far beyond desert survival skills. He understood the political currents that were shaping the territory's future, the economic forces that drove white expansion, and the cultural pressures that were fragmenting traditional Apache society. His decision to help her wasn't based on simple kindness, but on a sophisticated understanding of how small acts could influence larger patterns. Their shared journey was creating something unprecedented in both their experiences, a partnership based on mutual respect and complementary skills that transcended the usual boundaries between their peoples. Margaret brought knowledge of white society, literacy skills, and the maps that documented routes through the country that few Apache had explored in detail. Nalnish contributed intimate knowledge of the land, survival skills honed by generations, of desert living, and access to information networks that could mean the difference between life and death. By midday, they had reached a hidden valley that Nalnish described as one of his people's most sacred places. The valley was small, perhaps half a mile across, but it contained everything necessary for extended habitation. Clear springs, groves of oak trees that produced abundant acorns, and natural shelters formed by fallen boulders. What made the place truly remarkable were the pictographs that covered nearly every available rock surface. These weren't random decorations, but a systematic record of Apache history stretching back centuries. Migration routes, important events, genealogies of prominent families, and astronomical observations were all preserved in pigments that had retained their vivid colors despite exposure to desert conditions. Nalnish led Margaret to one particular panel that had obvious relevance to their situation. The pictographs showed meetings between Apache leaders and white officials, complete with symbolic representations of the agreements that had been made and broken over the years. But mixed among these diplomatic scenes were images that depicted cooperation rather than conflict, trading relationships, shared hunts, and even what appeared to be intermarriage between the communities. One image in particular captured Margaret's attention. It showed a white man and an Apache woman standing together beside a distinctive rock formation, with symbols around them that seemed to indicate partnership and mutual respect. The resemblance to the photograph Nalnish had shown her was unmistakable. "Your mother," Margaret said, pointing to the female figure. Nalnish nodded. "She painted this herself after your husband returned to his people. She wanted to record that cooperation was possible, even when the world seemed determined to prevent it." The conversation that followed revealed depths to their shared history that Margaret had never suspected. Her husband's collaboration with Ayana hadn't been a single expedition or brief encounter. They had worked together for nearly 2 years, mapping not just routes to mineral deposits, but documenting water sources, seasonal migration patterns, and safe havens that could benefit both Apache and white travelers. Their partnership had ended, not because of cultural conflicts, but because of political pressures from both sides. Apache leaders worried that too much cooperation with white military officers would compromise their negotiating position. White territorial authorities suspected that officers who worked too closely with Apache guides might be providing intelligence to potential enemies. William had been reassigned to duties that kept him away from Apache country, while Ayana had been pressured by her own people to maintain greater distance from white collaborators. But they had continued to correspond through intermediaries, sharing information that could prevent conflicts and save lives on both sides. The maps Margaret carried were the culmination of their collaboration, a record of knowledge that both had hoped could be used to prevent rather than cause violence. The fact that she was now following those same routes with Ayana's son felt like the completion of a circle that had been broken by forces beyond anyone's control. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the sacred valley, Nalnish introduced a new element that would complicate their journey even further. A runner had reached the valley the previous day with news that changed everything they thought they knew about the dangers ahead. The Esperanza mine, their ultimate destination, was no longer simply a lost treasure waiting to be rediscovered. Mexican military forces had begun systematically searching the area, apparently acting on intelligence that suggested American treasure hunters were planning a major expedition into territory that Mexico still claimed. More ominously, Apache war. Leaders had decided that the increased activity around the mine site represented a threat to sacred places in the surrounding mountains. Warriors from several bands were converging on the area, not to fight each other, but to prevent any further intrusions by outsiders. Margaret and Nalnish found themselves caught between multiple hostile forces, all converging on the same remote location for different reasons. Mexican soldiers, Apache warriors, American bounty hunters, and her own treacherous grandson were all heading toward the same destination, creating a situation that could explode into violence at any moment. The knowledge transformed their journey from a difficult but manageable challenge into something approaching a military campaign. Every decision about route, timing, and tactics would need to account for multiple hostile forces that might encounter each other as easily as they might encounter Margaret and her guide. But instead of a counseling retreat, Nalnish proposed an even bolder plan. Instead of trying to avoid all these dangers, they would use the chaos to their advantage. With so many different groups focused on the mine itself, the approaches might be less heavily guarded than anyone expected. More importantly, Nalnish had access to something that none of the other groups possessed: real-time intelligence about their movements and intentions. The same network that had warned him about bounty hunters could provide updates on Mexican military patrols and Apache war parties. As the sun set over the sacred valley, and they prepared for what might be their last peaceful night before entering the most dangerous part of their journey, Margaret reflected on how completely her life had been transformed. A week ago, she had been a desperate widow facing death in the desert. Now, she was part of a two-person reconnaissance team preparing to infiltrate territory contested by multiple armed forces. The change seemed impossible, but she felt more alive than she had in years. The skills and instincts that had carried her through decades of frontier life were finally being tested at their limits. And beside her sat a young man whose courage and intelligence had proven themselves worthy of the highest trust she could offer. Tomorrow would bring dangers that could easily claim both their lives. But tonight, in a valley painted with the history of successful cooperation between their peoples, Margaret felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She was no longer simply following her husband's maps toward a treasure that might not exist. She was helping to write a new chapter in a story that connected past and future, proving that understanding could triumph over the forces that sought to divide the world into irreconcilable enemies. The evening brought an unexpected visitor that would further complicate their already dangerous situation. As Margaret and Nalnish shared a simple meal beside their carefully concealed fire, they heard the distinctive whistle that Apache scouts used to announce their approach to friendly camps. From the darkness beyond their fire's glow emerged a figure that made Nalnish immediately rise to his feet in respectful greeting. The newcomer was an elderly Apache man, whose bearing and dress marked him as someone of significant status within his community. His hair was white with age, but his movements retained the fluid grace of a lifetime spent in harsh country. Nalnish spoke rapidly in his own language, gesturing toward Margaret and then toward the maps spread between them. The older man listened without interruption, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Nalnish finished speaking, the elder studied Margaret with eyes that seemed to see far more than her physical appearance. "I am Geronimo's brother," he said in accented but clear English. "My name is Chihuahua. I knew your husband." The simple statement hit Margaret with the force of revelation. Chihuahua was a name she had heard whispered in territorial settlements with a mixture of fear and respect. He was known as one of the most formidable Apache war leaders, a man whose raids had terrified white settlers across the Southwest. Yet here he sat calmly by her fire, speaking of her husband as if they had been old friends. "William never mentioned meeting you," Margaret said carefully, unsure of the proper protocol for addressing such a legendary figure. Chihuahua's lined face creased in what might have been amusement. White soldiers were not encouraged to speak of friendships with Apache leaders. Such talk could end careers or worse, but your husband was different from most. He understood that this land belonged to all who treated it with respect. The elder's presence transformed their small camp into something approaching a council meeting. He had not come alone. Margaret could sense other figures moving in the darkness beyond the fire's reach. Silent guardians ensuring that this unprecedented gathering remained undisturbed. "Nalnish tells me you seek the mine that the Mexicans call Esperanza," Chihuahua continued. "He says you carry maps made by your husband and my sister Ayana. This interests me greatly." Margaret nodded, uncertain how much she should reveal, but sensing that deception would be both futile and dangerous with this man. "My husband left me those maps, but I didn't understand their full significance until I met your nephew." "Ayana was not just my sister," Chihuahua said. "She was our band's keeper of sacred knowledge, the one who remembered the old stories and the locations of places where our ancestors walked. When she chose to share that knowledge with a white soldier, it caused much discussion among our people." The firelight played across his weathered features as he reached into a beaded pouch and withdrew an object that made Margaret's breath catch. It was a small gold nugget, rough and unpolished, but unmistakably valuable. "This came from the place you seek," he said simply. Ayana brought it to me after her last journey with your husband. She said it was proof that white men's greed and Apache wisdom could serve each other if the right people could be trusted with the knowledge. Margaret stared at the nugget, her mind racing with implications. Her husband had actually reached the Esperanza mine, had seen proof of its legendary wealth, but had never spoken of it to her or apparently to anyone else in white society. Why? She asked. Why keep it secret if they had found what they were looking for? Chihuahua's expression grew grave. Because they understood what you are only beginning to learn. Gold brings death to the desert. It brings armies and machines, and men who see the land only as something to be torn apart and consumed. Ayana and your husband agreed that such knowledge was too dangerous to share widely. Then why are you telling me this now? Because the secret is already broken, the elder replied. Mexican soldiers search the area because someone has told them Americans seek treasure there. Apache warriors gather because they know sacred places are threatened. The careful balance that Ayana and your husband tried to maintain has been destroyed by other forces. Nalnish spoke urgently in Apache, and Chihuahua nodded grimly before translating. My nephew tells me that your grandson and his partner have hired additional men in Tucson. They no longer travel as a small party seeking lost treasure. They come now as a well-armed expedition, equipped for fighting rather than prospecting. The news struck Margaret like a physical blow. Timothy's betrayal had grown beyond simple greed into something approaching a military operation. The thought of her grandson leading armed men into this delicate landscape filled her with horror. There's more, Chihuahua continued. The Mexican commander searching the area is Colonel Vasquez, a man known for his brutality toward both Apache and American intruders. He has orders to prevent any foreign mining operations by whatever means necessary. If he encounters your grandson's party, there will be bloodshed. Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Her decision to follow the maps had set in motion a chain of events that could result in dozens of deaths and the destruction of places that both cultures considered sacred. What can be done? She asked quietly. Chihuahua studied her for a long moment before answering. You could turn back, return to white settlements, and let others fight over secrets that should have remained buried. That would be the safe choice, the sensible choice, but you don't recommend it. No, he said simply, because you are the only person who might be able to prevent disaster. You know your grandson, understand how he thinks. You carry maps that show routes the other parties don't know about, and you travel with someone they would never suspect. He gestured toward Nalnish. My nephew could reach the mine site ahead of all the others. If you were there first, if you controlled access to the area, you might be able to prevent the violence that will surely come if these groups encounter each other without warning. The proposal was staggering in its audacity. Instead of avoiding the convergence of hostile forces, Chihuahua was suggesting they place themselves at the center of it, using their unique position to broker some kind of peaceful resolution. You're asking us to become mediators in a conflict that could involve dozens of armed men, Margaret said slowly. I am asking you to honor the work your husband and my sister began, Chihuahua replied. They believed that understanding between peoples was possible. Their maps were not just guides to treasure, but evidence that cooperation could benefit everyone. Now you have the opportunity to prove they were right. Margaret looked across the fire at Nalnish, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his young face. What Chihuahua proposed went far beyond the personal quest that had brought them this far. It would require them to risk everything on the chance that reason could prevail over greed, fear, and generations of mistrust. If we fail, she asked, then you will die as Ayana and your husband would have wanted you to, Chihuahua said with simple directness. Fighting for something larger than yourselves. The elder rose to his feet, signaling that the decision was theirs to make. I cannot order my nephew to risk his life for this cause, and I cannot force you to attempt something that may be impossible. But I can tell you that if you succeed, you will have done something that could change the future of this land." He reached into his pouch again and withdrew 2 items that he placed carefully beside the fire. One was a small silver cross, obviously of Mexican origin, but worn smooth by countless hands. The other was a traditional Apache medicine bundle, its leather wrapping decorated with symbols that spoke of protection and spiritual power. These belonged to a Mexican priest and an Apache medicine man who once worked together to prevent a war between their peoples, Chihuahua explained. They failed, and both died for their efforts, but they proved that some things are worth dying for, even when success is not certain. With that, he melted back into the darkness, as silently as he had appeared, leaving Margaret and Nalnish alone, with a decision that would determine not just their own fates, but potentially the lives of everyone converging on the lost mine. They sat in silence for a long time after his departure, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire burned lower, but neither moved to add fuel. The night sounds of the desert continued around them, the distant call of a coyote, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the whisper of wind through stone formations. Finally, Nalnish spoke. "My uncle asks much, perhaps too much." Margaret nodded. "He's asking us to prevent a war. 2 elderly people against armies and expeditions." "Not against," Nalnish corrected gently. "Between, standing in the middle, hoping that our presence might make others pause long enough to think rather than simply fight." The distinction was important, Margaret realized. They wouldn't be opposing the various forces converging on the mine. They would be trying to create a space where those forces might encounter each other without immediate violence, where negotiation might be possible instead of inevitable conflict. "Your mother and my husband believed it could work," she said, slowly. "In a different time, when there were fewer people and more room for compromise," Nalnish replied. "Now the stakes are higher, the pressures are greater." Margaret looked at the 2 objects Chihuahua had left beside their fire, symbols of failed cooperation, but also of the courage required to attempt it. The priest and the medicine man had died trying to prevent war, but their example had inspired others to continue working for peace. "I think," she said quietly, "that I've been running from the wrong thing. I thought I was fleeing Timothy's betrayal, seeking some kind of personal vindication, but maybe I was really running toward this choice." Nalnish studied her face in the firelight. "You would risk everything for the chance to prove that your husband's work had meaning." "I would risk everything to prove that understanding is possible," Margaret corrected. "That people can choose cooperation over conflict, even when everything around them seems to demand violence." The young Apache man nodded slowly. "Then we go forward, not as treasure seekers, but as peacemakers. Not to claim the gold, but to protect the sacred places where it lies hidden." They spent the remainder of the night planning their approach to what would be the most dangerous phase of their journey. Using both maps and Nalnish's knowledge of current conditions, they plotted a route that would bring them to the mine site ahead of the other parties, but still allow them to monitor the approaches. Their strategy would depend on timing, stealth, and an unprecedented level of trust between 2 people whose cultures had been taught to view each other as natural enemies. But as dawn broke over the sacred valley, where Apache history was written in stone, Margaret felt a confidence that surprised her. She was no longer simply following her husband's maps toward an uncertain destination. She was carrying forward the work that William and Ayana had begun, proving that the bonds between individuals could transcend the barriers that divided peoples. The gold that waited in the hidden mine was no longer important. What mattered now was the chance to honor the legacy of cooperation that had made their current partnership possible. The journey from the Sacred Valley toward the Esperanza mine transformed Margaret and Nalnish from travelers into tacticians, forced to think like military commanders while moving through a country that could kill them as easily as any human enemy. Their route followed ancient trails that wound through landscapes so remote that no white cartographer had ever attempted to map them accurately. Nalnish led them through a maze of slot canyons where the walls rose hundreds of feet overhead, creating corridors so narrow that pack animals couldn't pass through them. These hidden passages had served Apache war parties for generations, allowing small groups to move undetected across vast distances, while larger forces were forced to follow predictable routes through more open country. The physical demands were extraordinary. They climbed hand over hand up rock faces that would have challenged experienced mountaineers, crossed streams on logs barely wide enough for human feet, and navigated ledges where a single misstep would mean certain death. Margaret's 73-year-old body protested every challenge, but her frontier-hardened will proved equal to each test. What sustained her through the most difficult passages was the growing realization that she was retracing routes her husband had traveled 20 years earlier. William's careful notations on the military map showed that he had known about several of these hidden passages, knowledge that could only have come from Apache guides who trusted him completely. On the second day after leaving Chihuahua's council, they encountered the first evidence that other forces were converging on their destination. Fresh horse tracks crossed their path at a waterhole. Too many animals to represent a small party. The tracks were shod in the Mexican military style, confirming that Colonel Vasquez's expedition was already in the area. Nalnish studied the tracks with the intensity of a hunter reading sign. The horses were carrying heavy loads and moving at a pace that suggested urgency rather than careful scouting. More ominously, the direction of travel indicated that the Mexican force was heading toward the same general area that Margaret's maps identified as containing the mine. "They know something," Nalnish said quietly. "This isn't random searching. Someone has given them specific information about where to look." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The implications were staggering. If the Mexicans had detailed intelligence about the mine's location, it could only have come from one of three sources. Timothy and Henderson's party, captured Apache who had been forced to reveal sacred knowledge, or some other treasure hunter who had traded information for safe passage. None of these possibilities offered hope for a peaceful resolution to the converging crisis. Their second day of travel brought them to a vantage point that revealed the full scope of the developing situation. From a concealed position on a ridge overlooking a broad valley, they could see dust clouds raised by at least 3 different groups moving toward the mountain range that contained their destination. The largest dust cloud came from the south, almost certainly Colonel Vasquez's expedition. Through Nalnish's small telescope, they could make out the glint of sunlight on weapons and the organized movement of a disciplined military force. The Mexican column included not just cavalry, but pack animals carrying supplies for an extended campaign and what appeared to be mining equipment. From the northeast came a smaller but more ominous sign, smoke from what were obviously signal fires being used by Apache war parties to coordinate their movements. The smoke patterns were complex, carrying messages in a code that Nalnish could partially interpret. Warriors from at least 4 different bands were converging on the area, united by shared concern about threats to sacred places. Most troubling was the third group, approaching from the west, along what appeared to be a well-traveled freight route. This had to be Timothy's expanded expedition, and the size of the dust cloud suggested that Margaret's grandson had assembled a force far larger than she had imagined possible. "How many men could raise that much dust?" Margaret asked, dreading the answer. Nalnish studied the distance sign carefully before responding. 20, perhaps 30 riders, plus pack animals and supply wagons. This is not a prospecting party. It's a small army. The realization that her grandson had organized what amounted to a military expedition struck Margaret like a physical blow. Timothy's betrayal had grown beyond simple greed into something approaching conquest. He was bringing enough men and equipment to establish a permanent presence in the area, suggesting that his ambitions extended far beyond simply claiming the Esperanza mine. But the most chilling possibility was that all three forces might reach the contested area simultaneously. Mexican soldiers, Apache warriors, and American treasure hunters would encounter each other in country that offered little room for maneuver and no opportunity for retreat. The resulting conflict could escalate beyond anything the territorial authorities were prepared to handle. "We have to reach the mine first," Margaret said, stating what they both already knew. "Yes," Nalnish agreed, "but reaching it is only the beginning. Once we're there, we become the prize that everyone else is fighting over." The afternoon brought new intelligence that complicated their situation even further. Hidden in a grove of ancient oak trees, they encountered another Apache scout, a weathered warrior named Cochise, who served as Chihuahua's eyes and ears. In this remote country, Cochise brought news that transformed their understanding of the forces arrayed around them. The Mexican expedition was larger and better equipped than they had realized, including artillery pieces that could blast through rock formations if necessary. Colonel Vasquez had apparently convinced his superiors that American mining operations represented a serious threat to Mexican territorial claims. More disturbing was intelligence about Timothy's expedition. The additional men he had hired weren't simple prospectors or even experienced miners. Many were former Confederate soldiers who had drifted west after the Civil War, men skilled in warfare but lacking other prospects. They had been attracted, not just by promises of gold, but by the chance to strike back at federal authorities who they blamed for their post-war hardships. "Your grandson has told them this is more than treasure hunting," Cochise reported in heavily accented English. "He claims the federal government is trying to steal mineral rights that belong to territorial citizens. He has convinced them they are fighting for states' rights rather than personal profit." The news horrified Margaret. Timothy had weaponized the lingering bitterness of the Civil War, turning a treasure hunt into a political crusade that could have consequences far beyond the immediate area. If his expedition clashed with federal territorial authorities or Mexican military forces, it could trigger the kind of international incident that led to wars. But Cochise's most significant intelligence concerned the mine itself. Recent Apache scouting had revealed that the legendary Esperanza wasn't simply a single deposit of gold ore. It was an entire network of interconnected caverns and tunnels that had been worked by indigenous peoples for centuries before Spanish. Colonizers arrived. The gold that had attracted so much attention was only part of the site's significance. The caverns contained sacred chambers where Apache spiritual leaders had conducted ceremonies for generations. Disturbing these places wouldn't just be cultural vandalism, it would be an attack on the spiritual foundations of Apache society. "This is why so many warriors come," Cochise explained, "not just to fight for territory, but to protect places where our ancestors speak to us across the generations." Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settling even more heavily on her shoulders. The maps she carried weren't just guides to mineral wealth. They were keys to one of the most sacred sites in Apache territory. Her husband and Ayana had shared this knowledge across cultural boundaries, but they had also assumed it would be used responsibly. Now she faced the possibility that her quest for personal vindication could result in the destruction of irreplaceable sacred sites and the deaths of dozens of people on all sides of the developing conflict. "There has to be another way," she said, more to herself than to her companions. Cochise studied her with eyes that had seen too much violence in their time. "Perhaps, But it would require all sides to choose wisdom over pride, understanding over conquest. Such choices are rare when gold and glory are at stake. That evening, as they made camp in a hidden canyon that provided concealment from the various forces moving through the area, Margaret and Nalnish faced a decision that would determine the outcome of everything they had worked toward. They could still reach the mine ahead of the other parties, but doing so would place them at the center of a conflict they were poorly equipped to control. Alternatively, they could attempt to intercept one or more of the converging forces, trying to negotiate some kind of peaceful resolution before violence became inevitable. The choice was complicated by intelligence that continued to arrive through Apache communication networks. Timothy's expedition had been joined by a group of Mexican bandits who had offered to serve as guides in exchange for a share of any treasure. Recovered, the alliance between American treasure hunters and Mexican outlaws created new possibilities for misunderstanding and conflict. Meanwhile, Colonel Vasquez had apparently received orders to prevent any American mining operations by whatever means necessary, including the use of artillery to destroy access routes to contested areas. The Mexican commander was operating under the assumption that large-scale American mining operations were already underway, making him more likely to shoot first than to attempt negotiation. Most ominously, the various Apache war parties weren't operating under unified command. While they shared common goals, different bands had different leaders with varying approaches to dealing with the crisis. Some favored defensive strategies focused on protecting sacred sites, while others advocated preemptive attacks on any intruders, regardless of their intentions. "We're walking into a situation where everyone expects to fight," Nalnish observed, as they studied the intelligence reports. "Each group assumes the others are hostile, which makes actual hostility more likely." Margaret nodded, understanding the deadly logic of self-fulfilling prophecies. "Unless someone can convince them they're wrong before the shooting starts." "And that someone would have to be trusted by all sides," Nalnish added. "Which may be impossible." They spent most of the night developing what they privately called their impossible plan, a strategy for reaching the mine site, securing it against intrusion, and then attempting to negotiate with each group separately before they encountered each other. The plan required them to split up for the first time since their partnership began. Nalnish would use his Apache connections to communicate with the various war parties, carrying messages from Chihuahua that might convince the warriors to delay their attacks long enough for negotiation to be attempted. Meanwhile, Margaret would position herself at the mine entrance, using her age and apparent helplessness to convince approaching forces that the site was already occupied by someone who posed no threat to their interests. Her presence might buy enough time for cooler heads to prevail. It was a desperate strategy that depended on assumptions that might prove fatally wrong. They assumed Timothy would hesitate to harm his own grandmother, even after betraying her. They assumed Mexican military discipline would prevent soldiers from firing on an elderly civilian woman. They assumed Apache warriors would respect Chihuahua's authority enough to delay their attacks. Any of these assumptions could be incorrect, leading to disaster for everyone involved. But as dawn broke over their hidden canyon and the time for decision arrived, both Margaret and Nalnish understood that their impossible plan was the only alternative to certain violence. They had come too far and learned too much to simply abandon the effort when success seemed within reach. "My mother would say we're being foolish," Nalnish observed, as they prepared for what might be their final day together. "Your mother was willing to risk everything to prove that cooperation was possible," Margaret replied. "I think she would understand." They divided their supplies carefully, each taking enough water and food to survive for several days if circumstances prevented them from reuniting. Margaret kept her husband's original map, while Nalnish carried the Apache map that would allow him to approach the various war parties without being mistaken for an enemy. Most importantly, They each carried one of the symbolic objects Chihuahua had given them, tokens that might convince others of their peaceful intentions and their connection to the legendary cooperation between William Calloway and Ayana. As they prepared to separate, Margaret found herself looking at the young Apache man who had become her closest companion with emotions she couldn't easily define. He had saved her life, guided her through an impossible country, and shared knowledge that had transformed her understanding of her own husband's legacy. "If we don't see each other again," she said quietly, "I want you to know that traveling with you has been the greatest honor of my life." Nalnish nodded gravely. "You have shown me that the stories my mother told about your husband were true. Some white people can be trusted with sacred knowledge." They embraced briefly, an unprecedented gesture that would have scandalized observers from either of their cultures, but which felt completely natural in the context of their shared dangers and mutual respect. Then they separated, each following routes that would take them toward their destiny at the legendary Esperanza mine. Margaret watched Nalnish disappear into the maze of canyon walls, moving with the fluid grace that had first marked him as someone who belonged completely to this harsh landscape. For the first time in over a week, she was alone again. But this solitude felt completely different from the abandonment she had experienced after Timothy's betrayal. She was alone by choice, carrying out a mission that had grown far beyond personal vindication into something that could affect the future of the entire territory. The route to the mine took her through a country that seemed designed to test her resolve. Narrow passages between towering rock walls created a sense of claustrophobia that was broken only by sudden vistas that revealed the immensity of the landscape surrounding her. Ancient petroglyphs covered nearly every available rock surface, reminders that this land had been sacred to indigenous peoples for countless generations. As she climbed higher into the mountains, Margaret began to understand why the Esperanza mine had acquired such legendary status. The country itself seemed touched by supernatural forces, strange rock formations that appeared almost architectural in their precision, springs that emerged from solid rock without apparent source, and acoustic effects that carried sounds. For impossible distances, by midday she had reached the area her husband's map identified as containing the mine entrance. What she found exceeded even her expanded expectations of this extraordinary place. The mine wasn't simply a hole in the ground or even a series of tunnels. It was a natural cathedral carved from solid rock by geological forces so ancient they predated human presence in the region. The entrance was hidden behind a waterfall that dropped from heights invisible above, creating a curtain of mist that obscured the opening from casual observation. Behind the waterfall, passages led into chambers that had clearly been modified by human hands. Indigenous miners had expanded natural caverns, created ventilation systems, and established water sources that allowed for extended underground work. The scale of the operation suggested that gold extraction had been a major enterprise for the native peoples who had originally worked this site. Most remarkably, the chambers showed evidence of ceremonial use as well as practical mining. Walls were decorated with pictographs that seemed to blend spiritual imagery with practical information about ore deposits and extraction techniques. The integration of sacred and secular purposes explained why Apache leaders were so determined to protect this place from desecration. Margaret explored the accessible portions of the mine system, using her husband's detailed notes to navigate safely through passages that could easily become death traps for the unwary. She found evidence of William and Ayana's presence, carved initials, cached supplies, and most movingly, a small shrine where someone had left offerings that honored both Christian and Apache spiritual traditions. But she also found something that chilled her to the bone. Recent disturbance in several of the chambers indicated that someone else had been exploring the mine within the past few weeks. Tools had been left behind, new passages had been opened, and most ominously, several of the pictographs had been damaged by what appeared to be deliberate vandalism. Someone had reached the Esperanza, mine ahead of all the converging forces, and had begun the systematic destruction of its sacred elements while extracting whatever gold could be easily obtained. The realization transformed Margaret's understanding of the crisis yet again. Various military and treasure-hunting expeditions weren't racing to discover an untouched site. They were converging on a place that was already being destroyed by unknown parties who had no respect for either its historical significance or its spiritual importance. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the hidden canyon that contained the mine, Margaret heard the sounds that announced the end of her solitary guardianship. Horses, men's voices, and the metallic sounds of weapons being readied echoed from the canyon approaches. The convergence she and Nalnish had hoped to prevent was beginning, and she was alone at the center of it with no way to communicate with her Apache partner and no certainty that their impossible plan could succeed. But Margaret Calloway had not survived 73 years of frontier life by surrendering to despair when circumstances turned against her. She had reached the legendary Esperanza mine. She had discovered evidence of her husband's most important work, and she now stood at the center of events that could determine the future of relations between cultures in this contested territory. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the same courage that had brought her this far. The maps had led her to treasure far more valuable than gold, the chance to prove that understanding between peoples was possible, even in the face of forces that seemed determined to make conflict inevitable. The first group to reach the waterfall entrance was not any of the forces Margaret had expected. Instead, emerging from the mist like apparitions, came three men whose appearance immediately explained the recent vandalism she had discovered in the sacred chambers. They were hard-faced individuals whose clothing and equipment marked them as professional thieves rather than legitimate prospectors. Their leader, a scarred man with dead eyes and hands that never strayed far from his weapons, surveyed the mine entrance with the calculating gaze of someone who had spent years stealing from others. "Well, well," he said in a voice roughened by whiskey and violence. "Looks like we've got ourselves a guardian angel." Margaret had positioned herself on a natural stone platform that overlooked the waterfall, gambling that her age and apparent helplessness would make potential intruders hesitate long enough for explanation rather than immediate violence. Now she realized she had badly miscalculated the nature of the men she faced. These weren't soldiers following orders or treasure hunters driven by dreams of wealth. They were predators who had discovered the mine weeks earlier and had been systematically looting it while waiting for larger expeditions to arrive and provide cover for their activities. "Ma'am," the leader continued with mock courtesy that made Margaret's skin crawl, "you're sitting on property that doesn't belong to you. We're going to have to ask you to move along." Margaret drew herself up to her full height, calling upon decades of experience dealing with dangerous men on the frontier. "This site is under the protection of both Apache spiritual authorities and the United States territorial government," she said, with far more confidence than she felt. "Your presence here is illegal under both indigenous law and federal statute." The three men exchanged glances that spoke of shared amusement at her defiance. They had clearly dealt with opposition before and had developed efficient methods for eliminating it. "Federal statute," the leader repeated mockingly. "Out here, ma'am, we are the law. And Apache spiritual authorities don't much matter to men with rifles." He gestured to his companions, who began moving to flank Margaret's position. Their movements were coordinated and professional, speaking of military training that had been corrupted into criminal applications. But before they could complete their maneuver, the sound that Margaret had been dreading and hoping for simultaneously echoed through the canyon. The thunder of approaching horses, many of them, moving at speed toward the hidden mine. The thieves froze, instantly alert to the new threat. Their leader climbed quickly to a position where he could observe the canyon approaches, his casual menace replaced by focused tactical thinking. "Mexicans," he reported tersely. "Full military column, maybe 40 men. They're pushing hard, like they know exactly where they're going." Margaret felt her heart sink. Colonel Vasquez's expedition had arrived first among the legitimate forces, and Mexican military discipline meant they would secure the area with overwhelming force before asking questions. The brutal colonel's reputation suggested he would be more likely to shoot prisoners than to negotiate with them. "There's more," one of the other thieves called from his own observation post. "Dust cloud from the north. Big one. Could be your Apache friends, or could be those Confederate boys we heard were coming through." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Multiple armed forces were converging on the mine simultaneously, with Margaret and the three thieves caught at the center. Her plan had been to greet each group separately, using her age and apparent vulnerability to create opportunities for dialogue. Instead, she found herself trapped with criminals who would likely use her as a human shield when the shooting started. But Margaret Calloway had not survived 7 decades of frontier life by surrendering to circumstances beyond her control. If these men thought her age made her helpless, they were about to learn otherwise. "You gentlemen have a choice," she said calmly, reaching into her traveling bag as if looking for something harmless. "You can surrender to the approaching military forces and hope for mercy, or you can face both Mexican soldiers and Apache warriors." Simultaneously, the leader turned his attention back to her, irritated by her continued defiance. "Lady, you're in no position to be making threats." "I'm not making threats," Margaret replied, withdrawing from her bag not the weapon they might have expected, but something far more dangerous to their position. A brass military whistle that would carry for miles in the canyon acoustics. "I'm offering you an opportunity to survive the next hour." Before any of the thieves could react, she put the whistle to her lips and blew 3 sharp blasts, a cavalry signal for enemy in sight that would be recognized by military forces from either side of any conflict. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The thieves lunged toward her, but Margaret had already moved, using her knowledge of the mine's layout to disappear behind the waterfall into passages they hadn't fully explored. From the canyon below came answering signals. Mexican military, calls and what sounded like Apache war cries echoing off the stone walls. The converging forces had heard her signal and were now advancing with the urgency of troops expecting immediate combat. Margaret pressed deeper into the mine system, following routes her husband's map had shown her. Behind her she could hear the thieves cursing as they tried to pursue her through passages that required intimate knowledge to navigate safely. The sacred chambers provided temporary sanctuary, but Margaret knew it was only a matter of time before the various armed forces reached the mine entrance. When that happened, the thieves would likely use her as a bargaining chip or, more probably, eliminate her as a witness to their looting activities. She needed to reach Nelnish somehow, to warn him that their carefully planned strategy had been compromised by the presence of criminals who would complicate any attempt at peaceful negotiation. Using her husband's detailed notes, Margaret made her way through the ceremonial heart of the mine to a chamber she hadn't previously explored. According to William's map, this area contained an alternative entrance that connected to the canyon system where she and Nalnish had agreed to rendezvous if circumstances separated them. What she found exceeded her expectations. The chamber was clearly the most sacred space in the entire mine complex, its walls covered with pictographs that seemed to tell the complete spiritual history of the Apache people's relationship with this place. At the center of the room stood a natural altar where generations of offerings had been left by worshippers seeking guidance from their ancestors. But surrounding this sacred space was evidence of the thieves' systematic desecration. Pictographs, had been chipped away in attempts to remove precious pigments. The altar had been ransacked in searches for valuable offerings. Most horrifying of all, recent excavations had damaged the chamber's acoustic properties, which had clearly been designed to amplify ceremonial chants and prayers. Margaret felt anger rise in her chest like a physical force. The men who had done this weren't just thieves, they were vandals who had destroyed irreplaceable cultural treasures for momentary profit. Her personal quest for vindication seemed suddenly trivial compared to the larger crime being committed. Against both Apache heritage and human history, the sound of gunfire echoing through the mine system galvanized her into action. The various forces had reached the entrance, and violence had erupted just as she and Nalnish had feared it would. Following William's map, she found the alternative entrance, a narrow passage that emerged behind a screen of vegetation on the canyon's eastern wall. From this concealed vantage point, she could observe the chaos unfolding around the waterfall without being seen by any of the combatants. Colonel Vasquez's Mexican force had taken defensive positions around the mine entrance, their artillery pieces trained on the approaches. But they were facing threats from multiple directions as Apache warriors appeared on the canyon rims, and what was obviously Timothy's expedition approached from the western trail. In the middle of this developing battle, the three thieves had emerged from the mine and were attempting to surrender to anyone who would accept them. Their leader waved a white cloth while shouting in broken Spanish, trying to convince the Mexican soldiers that they were harmless prospectors caught in the crossfire. Margaret watched in horror as misunderstanding piled upon misunderstanding. The Mexicans assumed the thieves were advance scouts for the American expedition. The Apache warriors saw armed white men emerging from their sacred site and prepared for immediate attack. Timothy's force, arriving to find Mexican artillery aimed in their direction, began deploying for what they assumed would be a fight for their lives. All the elements for disaster were in place, and the first shots had already been fired. Unless someone could restore communication between the various groups, the next few minutes would see dozens of deaths and the complete destruction of the site that William and Ayana had worked so hard to protect. Margaret made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Instead of seeking safety and concealment, she stepped into the open and began walking toward the center of the developing battlefield. Her appearance had an immediate effect on the combatants. Mexican soldiers lowered their weapons slightly, confused by the sight of an elderly white woman approaching their positions without apparent fear. Apache warriors held their fire, perhaps recognizing something familiar. In her determined stride, most importantly, Timothy's voice rang out across the canyon as he recognized his grandmother. "Cease fire! Hold your positions! That's my grandmother!" The shooting stopped, replaced by a silence so complete that Margaret could hear the waterfall's splash and the nervous stamping of horses. Every eye was focused on her as she walked steadily toward the mine entrance, her traveling bag clutched in one hand and her husband's precious map in the other. "My name is Margaret Calloway," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the canyon acoustics. "I am the widow of Colonel William Calloway, who mapped this area 20 years ago with the cooperation of Apache guides. I claim this site under the right of prior discovery and the authority of sacred protection." The declaration was legally meaningless, but it accomplished what she had hoped. It established her identity and connection to the site while giving all parties a reason to pause before resuming hostilities. Colonel Vasquez rode forward, his uniform immaculate, despite the harsh conditions of desert campaigning. He was a man, in his 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority and the cold eyes of someone who had enforced that authority through violence when necessary. "Senora," he said in accented but precise English, "you are trespassing on territory claimed by the Republic of Mexico. These men with you are armed intruders who will be treated as invaders unless they surrender immediately." "These men are not with me," Margaret replied firmly. "The three who emerged from the mine are thieves who have been vandalizing this sacred site. My grandson's expedition was misled about the nature of this place, and the Apache warriors you see are here to protect their ancestral shrines from desecration." Timothy rode closer, his face showing a mixture of relief and embarrassment at finding his grandmother alive and apparently unharmed. "Grandmother, what are you doing here? How did you survive in the desert?" "I survived because I was helped by people you taught me to fear," Margaret replied, her voice carrying clearly across the canyon. "And I'm here because your betrayal led me to discover something far more important than gold." She held up her husband's map, making sure all the combatants could see it. "This mine isn't just a source of precious metal. It's one of the most sacred sites in Apache territory, a place where their ancestors have worshipped for centuries. The gold you're all fighting over is contained in chambers that serve as churches for people whose spiritual traditions are older than any European presence in this land." The revelation caused visible confusion among Timothy's men. Many were former Confederate soldiers who had been told they were fighting for territorial rights against Mexican oppression. The idea that they might be desecrating Native American religious sites clearly troubled some of them. Colonel Vasquez, however, seemed unmoved by appeals to cultural sensitivity. "Senora, whatever the historical significance of this place, it lies within territory that Mexico will defend against all foreign incursions. Your presence here and that of these armed Americans constitutes an act of aggression that requires immediate response." It was then that Nalnish appeared, emerging from concealment on the canyon rim with a small group of Apache warriors. His arrival transformed the tactical situation completely, as it became clear that the various forces were surrounded by indigenous fighters who controlled the high ground. "Colonel," Nalnish called down in clear Spanish, "my name is Nalnish, son of Ayana, daughter of Cochise. I speak for the war leaders who have gathered to protect this place. We do not seek war with Mexico or the United States. We seek only to prevent the destruction of our most sacred shrine." Margaret felt her heart lift at the sound of his voice. Their partnership had survived the chaos, and his presence meant that peaceful resolution might still be possible. "We propose a council," Nalnish continued, "where all parties can speak their concerns and seek solutions that honor both the sacred nature of this place and the legitimate interests of all who claim authority here." Colonel Vasquez looked skeptical, but the tactical reality of his situation was becoming clear. His artillery pieces were useless against enemies positioned on the canyon rims, and his cavalry would be slaughtered if they tried to charge up the narrow canyon walls. Timothy, meanwhile, was staring at Margaret with an expression that mixed shame, confusion, and growing understanding. "Grandmother, I thought you were dead. I thought the desert had killed you." "The desert tried," Margaret replied, "but I was saved by the son of the woman who once traveled with your grandfather, the same cooperation that created these maps. Timothy, the same willingness to see past differences that you abandoned when you left me to die." The weight of her words settled over the canyon like dust after an explosion. For the first time since the crisis began, all the combatants were listening rather than preparing to fight. Margaret stepped forward, positioning herself exactly at the center of the various forces. "I have a proposal that might serve everyone's interests," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. "The gold in this mine belongs to whoever can extract it legally and ethically, but the sacred chambers must be protected from further damage. The Apache people must be compensated for any disruption to their spiritual practices, and all parties must agree to share the benefits of any mining operations in ways that promote peace rather than conflict." It was an audacious proposal that challenged every assumption the various forces had brought to the confrontation. But it was also the only alternative to a battle that would destroy both the site and most of the people gathered around it. The silence that followed Margaret's proposal was broken by the sound of horses approaching from yet another direction. A new dust cloud was rising from the southern approach to the canyon, and the banners visible through the haze identified the newcomers as representatives of the United States territorial government. The convergence that Margaret and Nalnish had hoped to prevent was now complete. Every major power with claims on this contested territory was represented, armed, and facing each other across a killing ground that contained one of the most culturally significant sites in the entire Southwest. Margaret stood at the center of it all, an elderly widow who had transformed herself into a diplomat, carrying maps that represented cooperation between cultures and holding the thin hope that understanding might triumph over the forces of fear and greed that had brought so many armed men to this sacred place. The ultimate test of everything she and her young Apache partner had worked toward was about to begin. The arrival of the U.S. territorial government forces changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Led by Judge Harrison Mitchell, a man whose reputation for fairness had earned respect from both Mexican authorities and Apache leaders, the federal delegation brought with them something that had been absent from the canyon confrontation: legitimate, legal authority. Judge Mitchell surveyed the armed standoff with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades mediating frontier disputes. His small escort included a territorial marshal, a government surveyor, and most surprisingly, a Jesuit priest whose presence suggested that higher authorities understood the cultural dimensions of the crisis. "Colonel Vasquez," the judge called. "Out in fluent Spanish, I bring greetings from the territorial governor and authorization to negotiate boundary disputes under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo." The Mexican commander straightened in his saddle, recognizing both the diplomatic protocol and the legal framework being invoked. The treaty that had ended the Mexican-American War contained specific provisions for resolving territorial conflicts through arbitration rather than force. "Judge Mitchell," Vasquez replied formally, "Mexico welcomes legitimate discussion of these matters, but we cannot negotiate while facing armed American expeditions on territory we are bound by honor to defend." Mitchell's attention turned to Timothy and his men, who were still deployed in battle formation despite the changed circumstances. "Mr. Calloway, I presume? You and your associates will lower your weapons immediately and submit to territorial authority, or you will be arrested as armed insurgents operating without legal sanction." Timothy looked confused and angry, clearly unprepared for the legal complexities that were replacing what he had expected to be a simple treasure hunt. "Judge, we're American citizens exercising our legal right to prospect for minerals on public land." "This is not public land," Mitchell replied sharply. "According to territorial surveys, this area lies within boundaries that are disputed between the United States and Mexico. More importantly, it appears to contain sites that are sacred to indigenous peoples who have treaty rights that supersede mining claims." The judge's attention then focused on Margaret, who remained standing at the center of the various forces. "Mrs. Calloway, your presence here is both surprising and potentially significant. I understand you claim knowledge of previous surveys conducted in this area." Margaret felt the weight of all eyes upon her as she realized that her next words could determine whether the standoff ended in negotiation or bloodshed. She drew upon reserves of courage that had sustained her through the entire impossible journey. "Your Honor, I carry maps created through cooperation between my late husband, Colonel William Calloway, and Apache guides who shared their knowledge of this sacred site. These maps document not only mineral deposits, but also the cultural and spiritual significance of areas that have been damaged by illegal excavation." She gestured toward the three thieves, who were now under guard by both Mexican and American forces. These men have been systematically vandalizing pictographs and ceremonial chambers while stealing gold that belongs to the Apache people by right of ancestral occupation. Father Rodriguez, the Jesuit priest, stepped forward with obvious interest. Mrs. Calloway, you speak of pictographs and ceremonial chambers. As someone who has studied indigenous spiritual traditions, I would be very interested in examining these sites to assess their cultural significance. Nalnish descended from his position on the canyon rim, moving with the fluid grace that had first marked him as someone completely at home in this landscape. His appearance among the government officials created visible tension, but Judge Mitchell maintained his diplomatic composure. I am Nalnish, son of Ayana, who worked with Colonel Calloway to map this territory, he said in careful English. I speak for Apache leaders who seek protection for our ancestors' sacred places while recognizing the legitimate interests of all peoples who share this land. The formal introduction transformed the nature of the confrontation. Instead of facing faceless enemies, the various parties were now dealing with specific individuals whose connections to the disputed territory could be documented and verified. Judge Mitchell understood the implications immediately. Young man, if you can substantiate your claims about previous cooperation between Apache guides and U.S. military surveys, it could provide a legal framework for resolving this crisis without bloodshed. Margaret reached into her traveling bag and withdrew both maps, her husband's military survey and the Apache map that complemented it so perfectly. These documents showed 20 years of cooperation between peoples who were supposedly enemies. They prove that shared knowledge benefits everyone more than conflict. Father Rodriguez examined the pictographs that covered the canyon walls with growing excitement. His scholarly training allowed him to recognize the historical and cultural significance of what the thieves had been destroying. Judge Mitchell, he said urgently, these sites represent one of the most complete records of indigenous spiritual traditions I have ever encountered. Their preservation is not just important to Apache culture, it's crucial for understanding the entire human history of this region. Colonel Vasquez had been listening to the exchanges with growing interest. As a professional soldier, he understood the strategic value of avoiding unnecessary conflicts, especially when diplomatic solutions might serve Mexico's interests more effectively than military victories. Perhaps, he said slowly, there are solutions that honor all legitimate claims while preventing the destruction of sites that have value beyond their mineral content. The breakthrough came when Judge Mitchell proposed something unprecedented in territorial law, a joint commission that would include representatives from the United States, Mexico, and Apache tribal authorities. This commission would have authority to regulate access to the mine while ensuring that any extraction activities respected both cultural sensitivities and international law. The gold exists, Mitchell said pragmatically. Attempting to prevent all extraction would be futile and would likely lead to increased illegal activity, but extraction can be conducted in ways that preserve sacred areas while providing benefits to all parties with legitimate claims. Timothy, who had been silent during most of the negotiations, finally spoke up. What about our investment? We've spent months organizing this expedition, hired men, purchased equipment. Are we supposed to just walk away with nothing? Margaret looked at her grandson with a mixture of sadness and hope. Timothy, you'll walk away with something far more valuable than gold. You'll walk away with the knowledge that cooperation serves everyone better than betrayal. She turned to address all the assembled forces. I propose that my grandson's expedition be incorporated into the Joint Commission as the American mining representatives. Their investment and equipment can be put to legitimate use under proper oversight. The proposal was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of punishing Timothy's group for their irregular approach to the situation, It offered them a legitimate role in the resolution, while ensuring that their activities would be properly supervised. Nalnish added his own contribution to the merging agreement. Apache representatives will serve as cultural monitors, ensuring that sacred areas are protected while sharing traditional knowledge about seasonal access routes and sustainable extraction methods. Over the following hours, the framework of an unprecedented agreement took shape. The Esperanza mine would be operated as an international venture, with profits shared between the United States, Mexico, and Apache tribal authorities. Cultural preservation would be overseen by a combination of indigenous experts and scholarly authorities like Father Rodriguez. Most importantly, the site would serve as a model for how different peoples could cooperate in developing natural resources. While respecting cultural heritage and environmental sustainability, the three thieves were taken into custody by territorial marshals, facing charges for vandalism of culturally significant sites as well as theft. Their removal eliminated the criminal element that had threatened to complicate any peaceful resolution. As the sun began to set over the canyon, casting long shadows across the ancient pictographs and the modern camp that had sprung up around the mine entrance, Margaret found herself sitting beside the waterfall with Nalnish, watching the various groups make camp in positions that suggested cooperation rather than confrontation. "Your mother would be proud," she told the young Apache man who had become her closest friend. "Your husband as well," Nalnish replied. "They planted seeds that took 20 years to grow, but the harvest has finally come." Timothy approached them hesitantly, his earlier arrogance replaced by something approaching humility. "Grandmother, I owe you an apology that words can't express. I thought I was protecting my inheritance, but I nearly destroyed something far more valuable." Margaret studied her grandson's face, seeing genuine remorse where she had expected continued defiance. "Timothy, your real inheritance isn't gold or land, or even the maps your grandfather left behind. It's the knowledge that different peoples can work together when they choose understanding over fear." The following weeks transformed the remote canyon into a bustling center of controlled activity. Engineers from 3 countries worked together to design extraction methods that would preserve the sacred chambers while allowing access to mineral deposits. Apache cultural experts worked alongside Mexican archaeologists and American mining specialists to document the site's historical significance. Margaret found herself serving as an unofficial ambassador between the various groups, her unique position as the widow of the original surveyor and partner of an Apache guide, giving her credibility with all parties. Her small cabin near the mine entrance became a neutral meeting place where disputes could be resolved through discussion rather than confrontation. Nalnish established a school where young people from all 3 cultures could learn about the history and significance of the region. The curriculum included traditional Apache knowledge about desert survival, Mexican expertise in desert agriculture, and American techniques for sustainable resource development. The gold that had attracted so much attention and caused so much conflict proved to be abundant enough to provide significant benefits to all the participating communities. But more valuable than the precious metal were the relationships that developed between peoples who had previously viewed each other as enemies. Margaret's personal transformation was perhaps the most remarkable of all. The elderly widow who had been abandoned to die in the desert had become a respected leader whose opinions were sought by government officials, military commanders, and tribal elders. Her age, which had once seemed like a liability, was now recognized as a source of wisdom and perspective that younger negotiators lacked. One evening, as she sat beside her fire reading from one of the books she had carried throughout her desert odyssey, Margaret reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this place. She had set out seeking vindication for a personal, betrayal, and had found instead a purpose that connected her to something larger than her individual grievances. The maps her husband had left behind were no longer simply guides to mineral wealth. They had become symbols of the cooperation that was possible when people chose to see past their differences toward their common interests. A year after the crisis at the Esperanza mine, Margaret received a visit from Judge Mitchell, who brought news that the Joint Commission's work was being studied by territorial authorities throughout the Southwest as a model for resolving similar conflicts. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "you've accomplished something that many people thought was impossible. You've proven that cooperation between different cultures can serve everyone's interests better than conflict." Margaret smiled, thinking of her husband and Ayana, whose vision had finally been realized, despite all the forces that had seemed determined to prevent it. "Judge, I didn't accomplish this alone. Every person who chose understanding over fear, every individual who was willing to listen rather than simply fight, they all contributed to this outcome." As Mitchell prepared to leave, he brought one final piece of news that completed Margaret's sense of closure. "The territorial governor has asked me to inform you that your grandson Timothy has requested assignment to the Joint Commission as a permanent representative. He apparently wants to continue the work you and his grandfather began." Margaret nodded, feeling a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal vindication. The betrayal that had driven her into the desert had ultimately led to reconciliation that bridged both family divisions and cultural barriers. That evening, she and Nalnish sat together beside the waterfall, watching the stars emerge in the desert sky. Their unlikely partnership had grown into a friendship that transcended every boundary their respective cultures had erected. "What comes next?" Nalnish asked, his question encompassing both their personal futures and the larger work they had helped to begin. Margaret looked out across the canyon, where 3 flags now flew together over the mine entrance, American, Mexican, and Apache symbols of the cooperation that had replaced conflict. "We keep building bridges," she said simply. "We keep proving that understanding is possible, even when everything seems to argue against it." The desert that had nearly claimed her life had instead given her a purpose that extended far beyond her remaining years. In the vast landscapes where different peoples had learned to share both resources and respect, Margaret Calloway had found her true inheritance: the knowledge that hope could triumph over fear, and that cooperation could overcome even the deepest divisions between peoples. The maps that had guided her to the Esperanza mine would continue to guide others toward the greater treasure of mutual understanding, long after the gold was exhausted and the canyon returned to its ancient silence. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.